Good afternoon, everyone. iTech India welcomes all the participants for today's National Distance Learning Seminar. Today's topic is HIV and diabetes, and the speaker is Dr. S.K. Guha, Program Director, COE, STM, Kolkata. Dr. S.K. Guha is a MBBS and a Diploma in Tropical Medicine and Hygiene and MD in Tropical Medicine, Fellow Indian College of Physicians, is a Professor of Tropical Medicine and Medical Superintendent, come Vice President, Program Director, COE, and the program in charge of the postgraduate diploma in HIV medicine at IGNOU. He has undergone several trainings, including short course in antiretroviral treatment from Prince Leopold Institute of Tropical Medicine, Antwerp, Belgium, and the WHO advanced training of second line ART in Bangkok. He has many articles published on malaria, leishmaniasis, hepatitis, and HIV/AIDS in many national and international peer-reviewed journals. We welcome you, sir, for today's session.
Myself. Good afternoon. I hope I am audible now.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. In the midst of a pandemic of COVID-19, we are discussing today an important issue of two chronic illnesses. One, chronic manageable infectious disease, and another chronic metabolic disorder. That's of HIV and diabetes. So basically, what I'm going to do in the next 40 to 45 minutes is I will give a brief epidemiology of both the diseases, but the focus will be on diabetes, since HIV epidemic is all known to us, those who are working in the ART centers, because every day we are dealing with HIV and related issues. And importantly, how does these two, one non-infectious chronic manageable infectious disease and how a chronic metabolic disease with multiple target organ damage is related. So we'll try to find out, is there any association between diabetes and HIV? We'll try to explore to that into this presentation and try and find out the pathophysiologic mechanism to which the two diseases are actually interlinked. And finally, the last segment would be a little bit of practical issues, like what are the management concerns of managing such HIV patients with diabetes. Now, this slide is known to you, all of you, as of the end of 2018. According to the UNAIDS projections, there were around 37.9 million people living with HIV at the end of 2018. And around 1.7 million people were infected in that year, despite a whole lot of prevention programs. Although the new infection rates are coming down, still a good number of people are still being infected with HIV. And significantly, there are around 700,000 deaths which are related to HIV also. And if you look into the other data, that you can find a significant proportion of them are actually women. And there is also a considerable number of children with HIV. Now, coming to the issue of diabetes, as you all know, the WHO has stated its position statement that there has been a significant rise in the number of people living with diabetes from 108 billion in the year 1980 to 422 million in the year 2014. And the rise of global prevalence of diabetes amongst adults has actually it has gone up from 4.7% in 1980 to almost doubled up at 8.5% in the year 2014. And if you look into a little bit into the data, that the prevalence is rising more rapidly in the low and middle income countries as compared to the well-established or the countries with higher resources. And diabetes, as we all know, is one of the major cause of blindness, renal failure, myocardial infarction, stroke, and peripheral vascular diseases. And it's estimated that about 1.6 million deaths were directly caused by diabetes. That was the estimate of by WHO. And diabetes was the seventh leading cause of death in 2016. So if you see that, like HIV is a big public health problem of infectious etiology. Similarly, diabetes, a metabolic disorder, is also having a significant morbidity as well as mortality. Now, this is a more latest, the recent uh, data on diabetes. This is from International Diabetes Federation or IDF Diabetes Atlas. This is the latest edition, November last year. They have taken data from 255 high quality data source from 138 countries, and the prevalence was 9.3%. And actual term, the number is actually 463 million people with living with diabetes. And importantly, what are the projections? They have projected that by 2030, the number will reach 578 million, or in other words, 10.22%. Prevalence will go up from 9.3 to 10.2%. And by 2045, it will be 700 million, or 10.9% of the world population. The same study also observed that they have got a higher urban prevalence, 10.8%, than rural, 7.2%. So more than 3.6% higher urban prevalence, and higher prevalence in high income than in low income countries, 10.4% in high incomes and then in low income countries. This is the global data which is published by International Diabetes Federation, IDF. And what about our own country? This is ICMR India Diabetes, or ICMR India B, popularly known. They did a study in 15 states across the country. That was way back in 2009 to 12 to 13 in different phases. So it is included states from Northeast, states from Eastern India, few southern states, as well as states from North India like Chandigarh, and then Delhi, and then states from western part of the country. That was a country representative sample. And the prevalence was found to be 7.3% with a very narrow confidential interval between 7.0 to 7.5. And it was also observed that higher urban prevalence in our country, 11.2%, than rural, 5.2%. And this difference in urban-rural prevalence amongst of diabetes was statistically highly significant. And what were the independent risk factors in that study? They came out with age, increasing age, male gender, obesity, concomitant hypertension, and family history of diabetes were actually independent risk factors for development of diabetes. Now, if you look into the association between HIV and diabetes, in the pre-heart era, or in the era when in 1980s, 1990s, there were studies from mostly from the Western world. There, the prevalence of diabetes was low, 2 to 2.6% amongst PLHIV community. But this is, mind that, this was in the pre-heart era. Then there was a good study, MAX cohort. Probably all of you have heard of MAX cohort. This is a cohort of men who have sex with men and bisexual men in USA, and they have got a whole, and they are followed up. So it's a big cohort of more than 5,600 people, and it was longitudinally followed up between 1984 to 1999. And they did an analysis of, and some of them are actually HIV infected, and a majority were HIV uninfected. Some also had hepatitis B, C, and other STIs all. Now, they did a prospective follow-up analysis of 1,773 such MSM and bisexual men from April 99 to March 2003. It was a prospective follow-up analysis, and there they could find out that the prevalence of diabetes was 14% in the HIV positive group, those who are on antiretroviral therapy, as compared to only 5% in the HIV negative MSM. And the prevalence ratio was 4.6. So, and this was actually adjusted for the age and BMI, etc. The other determinants were also, they were adjusted for. So you could find that people on heart, MSM on heart, they had a higher prevalence of diabetes, like 14%, as compared to the others who were on 5% only in the HIV negative population. Now, the incident rate of diabetes was also 4.7 cases per 100 persons years among HIV positive on heart versus 1.4% per cases per 100 person years in HIV negative. So this study actually has thrown a light that probably people on ART are likely to develop higher incidence of diabetes mellitus. So that was the starting point. Then people also analyzed the DAD data. DAD, and this was basically data collection on antiretroviral drug toxicities. This is a huge cohort, almost more than 33,000 PLHAV who were followed up for an average period of 3.8 years. The prevalence at baseline when they entered into this cohort was just less than 3%, 2.9% actually. And when these patients were followed up for a period of average 3.8 years, then it was found that they are developing diabetes. And what were the predictors of new onset of diabetes? Higher glucose, higher fasting plasma glucose is one observed factor. Increased BMI, increased TG level, older age, and the recent CD4, if it is less than 200, that was also confirmed. Lipodystrophy and predictors of new onset diabetes, or these are were predictors of new onset diabetes mellitus. Okay, and when they looked into their antiretroviral drugs, and these were the generation who received antiretrovirals of the older generations. Let's say for zidovudine, stavudine, didanosine, amongst the nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors. Among the protease inhibitors, they received all the first generation PIs like indianavir, nadfinavir, ritonavir, and as well as saquinavir. So these were thought to be some risk factors as well. And then another study from the Swiss cohort, Swiss HIV cohort, another very well managed cohort from Europe of HIV positive persons, more than 27,000 patient a year of follow up among 6,500 odd patients. The prevalence was 4.4% diabetes per prevalence, and the estimated incidence was 3.12 cases per 1,000 person year at follow-up. And it was observed that there is an increased incidence rate was seen amongst male, gender, older age, black, Asians, as well as CDC-C conditions or WHO stage 4 conditions, and obesity. And they too also has seen that there is a strong association with the older generation of NRTIs like zidovudine, stavudine, didanosine, zalcitabine, as well as the conventional first generation PIs like indianavir, then the saquinavir, ritonavir, nelfinavir, etc. Now, the funny thing came out from the Danish HIV cohort. This was also a large cohort, and this actually has shown that when the matched HIV negative controls, almost 5,000 HIV positive persons, the Danish cohort, they matched HIV negative controls. They were followed between 1996 to 1999. A higher risk of diabetes mellitus in HIV positive group was seen. Adjusted incident rate ratio was high, almost greater than 3.24. And and they analyzed the data when between 99 to 2010, no such increased incidence for diabetes mellitus was seen, with the adjusted incident risk ratio being just 0.9. So it was not significant. So what could be the results? So the same cohort, when they are followed between 96 to 99, showing an increased rate ratio of diabetes mellitus, whereas the same cohort when between 99 to 2010, it was seen. The reason is that during the first period, 96 to 99, all of them were on the older generation of NRTIs and older generation of PIs. On the contrary, 99 to 2010, the patients were moved to the newer generation NRTIs like, let's say, tenofovir, abacavir, and NNRTI, particularly efavirenz and nevirapine. So that was the thing where there was no increased risk of diabetes. So probably antiretroviral drugs have got a relation with the development of diabetes mellitus. And but then people actually criticize this Danish cohort data because the role of multiple confounders like acute opportunistic infections and differences among various ethnic groups were actually not looked into. They are not adjusted. So that could be one small point which goes against this data, but then again, it shows such a picture. Now, if you look into the recent studies, very well designed studies, these recent evidences from two large nationally representative health service in USA. One is the medical monitoring project. This is for HIV positive persons. They have recruited 8,610 patients. And the other is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NANES, where they have included 5,604 general population in the year 2009 to 2010. The prevalence of diabetes in the HIV positive group was 10.3%, and it was 3.8% higher than in general population. And we remember that these two data actually had a very good representative population of USA. And the risk factors that was seen in the study, women had a higher prevalence difference of 5%, age group, younger age group, 20 to 44 years, 4.1% higher prevalence, and the non-obese subjects, lean subjects, 3.5%, they had increased prevalence as compared to general population. So something new came out from this study, that younger age groups, HIV positive patients developing diabetes in a younger age groups in 20 to 44, as well as non-obese or lean subjects are also developing uh, uh, diabetes, in contrast to the conventional risk factor of obesity. Now, this same study has actually shown when amongst the PLHIV, majority was actually type 2 diabetes, 52.3%. Only around 3.9% were type 1 diabetes or insulin dependent diabetes, and the large portion was actually unspecified, the type of diabetes. And the difference in frequency was highest with HCV co-infection, 6.3%. High school education 5.1%, women 5%, non-Hispanic whites, and those at or below the poverty line, obesity, as well as age, as I said earlier, between 20 to 44 or younger age group. So we need to remember HCV co-infection with HIV has got a higher likelihood to have diabetes. Similarly, we have also talked about women and the other factors. Now, coming to the pathophysiologic hypothesis, what I am not going into the very detail on this issue. What are the factors that have been proposed of this uh, collaboration between HIV and diabetes? One is the antiretroviral drugs that I was talking about. HCV co-infection I have just mentioned. On the cellular level is the mitochondrial dysfunction, which is typically seen with NRTIs, which causes mitochondrial toxicity, hepatic steatosis, insulin resistance. All these are can happen. Elevated circulated free fatty acids are also can be a consequences of insulin resistance, and increased muscle and organ fat. This is also very important, but it could be due to the drug, it could be due to the disease itself, and elevated pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha, and some there might be certain genetic predispositions as well. Now let's have a closer look at the antiretroviral drugs. Antiretroviral drugs has been proposed that it could be diabetes due to ART, could be a consequence of increased weight gain and improvement in well-being following ART with an increased consumption of food and increased consumption of calorie. And if it is coupled with an adverse physical style, I mean the physical health style, then that can lead into diabetes. However, there are certain specific effects of drugs that through either by metabolic dysfunction or insulin resistance or dyslipidemia and lipodystrophy, they can also add to the development of diabetes. If you look into the boosted protease inhibitors like atazanavir, darunavir, lopinavir, saxinavir, and ritonavir that we are commonly used in our day-to-day practices, these drugs are all have been incriminated in the development of diabetes, or at least rise in fasting plasma glucose or hyperglycemia. And importantly, when the PIs are taken off, the hyperglycemia in most occasions they get reversed. This is one important issue. Increased insulin resistance and diminished insulin secretion by interfering with the GLUT4 is to be the thought to be the mechanism of development of diabetes by the antiretroviral drugs. They are also known to interfere with the cellular retinoic acid binding protein or CRABP1, which in turn inhibits the paroxysmal proliferator activated receptor or PPAR gamma that leads to insulin resistance, adipocyte inflammation, as well as release of free fatty acids in the blood. NRTIs increase the risk of diabetes mellitus. It's not only the PIs, NRTIs also increase the risk of diabetes, particularly stavudine, which is the higher than zidovudine and diadenosine. But then again, we don't use diadenosine and stavudine these days. Few of our patients are still on zidovudine who will be soon shifted to other drugs. Lipodystrophy, we all know about the fat maldistribution. It can be both hypertrophy, lipoatrophy, as well as lipohypertrophy. Lipoatrophy takes place in the face, in the limbs, in the buttocks, and the lipohypertrophy takes place in the abdominal, increase in abdominal gut or abdominal obesity. It could be cervicodorsal pad of fat. It could be increase in size of breasts, both in men and as well as women. And it could be actual multiple lipomatosis can also take place. And when you talk about increase in abdominal gut, it is not only a parietal fat, it's also a visceral fat, which is an atherogenic fat that leads to other problems of coronary artery disease and peripheral vascular disease, etc. Dyslipidemia is often associated with lipodystrophy. Increased TNF leads to insulin resistance, that leads to impaired glucose tolerance or impaired fasting glucose, and the development of diabetes mellitus later on. Higher CRP and leptins with corresponding lower adiponectin levels can lead to diabetes mellitus as well. In a study, small study, 64% or in other words, 74 out of 116 PLHIV receiving protease inhibitors for an average of 14 months. They developed lipodystrophy syndrome as compared to only 1 in 32 in PI naive subjects. So lipodystrophy is strongly linked with protease inhibitor use. Protease inhibitors differ on metabolic effects. Some drugs can have only effect on the lipids, others have effect on lipid as well as glucose. Sorry. And These are also known to us, and we have seen in our ART centers that lipodystrophy also occurs with NRTIs, particularly with stavudine and zidovudine. Stavudine, we are all aware of that, and zidovudine is also people who are still on ZLN or ZLE. Some of them are still having significant lipoatrophy. Now, co-infections, two co-infections actually stand out with HIV in terms of causation association with diabetes. One is then I have already talked about HCV co-infected patients. They are at risk of insulin resistance. HIV and HCV co-infected patients, they are at risk of insulin resistance and diabetes mellitus due to increased intrahepatic TNF as well as hepatic steatosis. And it has been seen that persons with more than 40 years of age with HCV co-infection, HCV, they are 3 times more likely to have diabetes as compared to the person of the same year without, of the same age without HCV infection. This is leaving aside an HIV. I am talking about HCV monoinfection. A person with age for more than 40 years with HCV monoinfection, he or she is 3 times more likely to develop diabetes as compared to a person of the same age but without HCV infection. Now, TB, as we all know, is the commonest severe opportunistic infection in HIV, not only in our country but in many of the low and middle income countries. Now, what is known that TB, it's known well known that TB worsens glycemic control, and similarly, poorly controlled diabetes might augment the severity of TB infection. So that is a vicious cycle. We talk about HIV TB, similarly, diabetes TB also is a vicious cycle. Now there are studies, interesting studies. One study from Nigeria has actually shown, one study from Nigeria and another from Turkey has shown that TB patients had, when they were diagnosed TB, they had impaired glucose tolerance, and they are found to have, and then they were put on anti-TB, standard anti-TB treatment, and the same, and they are not put on any anti-diabetic medications. So after 3 months, their OGTT or oral glucose tolerance test came down to normal. And when the cohort were followed up to 2 years in Turkey, still they were having a normal OGTT. So it seems that probably TB causes a transient dysglycemia or hyperglycemia in both HIV positive as well as HIV negative subjects. Now, the another factor that has been proposed is autoimmunity and endocrinopathy. If you look into the earlier reports, we don't see many pancreatic islets and antibody being reported in HIV positive persons. However, there are reports that after starting antiretroviral therapy, as the viruses get suppressed and the CD4 counts get restored, there might be immune restoration, autoimmune diabetes. There are reports of such autoimmune diabetes are coming up. Anti-GAD antibody has been demonstrated in Japan in some PLHIV after successful response to the antiretroviral therapy. The other important issue is the growth hormone resistance might occur due to insulin resistance in PLHIV. That can also attribute to the development of diabetes in the PLHIV. Now, what are the concerns of diabetes treatment in PLHIV? That you might ask me. What could be the major issues? Now, I will take you through the drugs that we commonly use in our day-to-day clinical practice. Metformin, you know, this is the biguanide, and this is the first-line drug for type 2 diabetes. It can reduce the HbA1c by to the tune of 1% when it is used alone, and it has got a proven long-term safety and efficacy data. It doesn't cause weight gain. There might be little loss of weight also. Hypoglycemia is not seen when this is used alone. It's a low-cost generic formulation is available. That's why this is the preferred first-line drug for all type 2 diabetes newly diagnosed. Side effects, we all know GI intolerance initially is there, But the rare but the important one is actually lactic acidosis. Lactic acidosis. And metformin has another benefit that it's an independent cardiovascular disease risk reduction. That's one of the benefits. So these days, diabetologists and endocrinologists, they always look into when anti-diabetic agents, they look into whether the drugs can help in management of heart failure or the role of the drug in heart failure and whether it can reduce the CVD risk, can it reduce glycemic the lipids as well. But we know but metformin, why I have highlighted metformin, because we have now entered in the era of dolutegravir. We have moved into the raltegravir to dolutegravir transition has been taken place, and then probably we are going into phases from ZLN and to this thing, dolutegravir based, and finally the new ministrations will soon start with dolutegravir based. Now, dolutegravir has got a drug-drug interaction with metformin. That's why I wanted to highlight this point here. The standard dose, as you all know, dolutegravir 50 mg once daily. If you combine with metformin 500 milligram twice daily, that results in significant increase in the area under the curve of metformin by 79%, and the Cmax goes up to 66%. So that's why it is stated that one should not increase the dose of metformin of more than 1 gram per day when it is combined with dolutegravir. That we need to, because metformin standard dose in adults is 2 gram per day, standard dose. So they usually gradually start with low dose and gradually build up, but beyond 2 gram, nobody uses it because that's not recommended. Doesn't give you much benefit, but up to 2 gram is the optimal daily dose in an adult patient. But if it combined with dolutegravir, we cannot use 2 gram per day. We would be required to use it 500 milligram BID. That will be fine. That will be have an action of around 1 gram per day. And we need to look into the because that might lead into lactic acidosis. If someone inadvertently uses a 2 gram metformin with dolutegravir 50 mg, probably the likelihood of development of lactic acidosis will be there in the PLHIV. And metformin can be used with mild renal insufficiency, but if the EGFR is less than 30, it should be avoided. Sulfonylurea, we know all about this: glimepiride, the long-acting, the short-acting, the glipizide, gliclazide, ultra-short-acting, and gliburide or glibenclamide are not popular these days, but still there in the market. And they actually stimulate the insulin release from the pancreatic beta cells. And like metformin, they too can affect 1% reduction in A1C. They have got long safety and efficacy record. They are also cheap. Generic preparations are available. But the problem lies with weight gain, which can be between 2 to 4 kg. Hypoglycemia is the important side effect of sulfonylureas, and more importantly, high failure rates. So the failure rates are higher with sulfonylureas, all molecules. And what about the new drugs, antiretrovirals we use? There is no significant drug-drug interaction between sulfonylurea and antiretrovirals. The thiazolidinediones, rosiglitazone and pioglitazone are the prototype of the drug. Pioglitazone is mostly used. They improve the target cell response to insulin. That's why the glucose gets metabolized appropriately. It offers 1% reduction in HbA1c when used alone. Pioglitazone has an independent CVD risk reduction benefit by increasing the HDL cholesterol and decreasing TG and liver fat levels. It doesn't produce hypoglycemia of its own, but the side effects that restrict its use is basically fluid retention that leads to edema, and a person who is having a compromised ejection fraction might land up with heart failure, with a higher dose of pioglitazone. Weight gain because of fluid retention is a side effect, and the possibly increased risk of heart failure and the bladder cancer has also been highlighted these days. Insulin, I'm not going into detail. The standard injectable, probably this is the drug of choice in diabetes is the HIV. It doesn't interfere with antiretrovirals. Importantly, it reduces the markers of inflammation like TNF, which is common accompaniment in HIV disease. Uh, but the side effects should be one should be aware of. One is an hypoglycemia with insulin. If the patient fails to take a meal or misses meal or goes for an strenuous, unaccustomed exercise following insulin, might land up with hypoglycemia, and certain drugs might also cause hypoglycemia unawareness, and there might be weight gain with insulin. Now there are newer insulins and analogs that I'm not going to discuss today because they are not routinely used in an ART center settings. They are all costly. However, they have got lower incidence of hypoglycemia, and then they offer much better control of your blood glucose levels. Now, the other group that we use these days, the gliptins or DPP-4 inhibitors. There are plenty of drugs: vildagliptin, sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, teneligliptin. They basically enhance the glucose-dependent insulin secretion, low GI side effects, and low discernible weight loss, but potential risk for acute pancreatitis and arthralgia. That we need to remember. They usually they don't interfere with CD4 count or HIV viral load. Uh, One drug-drug interaction is important. Saxagliptin, the dose should not exceed 2.5 milligram per day when used with the ritonavir boosted PI, because ritonavir kicks up the blood level of saxagliptin because it interferes with its metabolism. And linagliptin is the drug which doesn't require any renal dose adjustment. Others require uh, renal dose adjustment like teneligliptin, uh, saxagliptin, sitagliptin, etc. And the last segment of drugs is basically the SGLT2 inhibitors or gliflozins. These are the talk of the town amongst endocrinologists and diabetologists. There are plenty. The initial ones are canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, as well as empagliflozin. They blocks reabsorption. They have got a novel mechanism of action of controlling diabetes. They blocks reabsorption of glucose from the renal tubules and promote loss of glucose in the urine. And they have these the, recently concluded large trials have shown that both empagliflozin as well as canagliflozin has is associated with significant reduction of cardiovascular disease risk. Reduction is there, and they are also beneficial in heart failure. All canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, as well as empagliflozin. Advantages are weight loss. The obese diabetics would be losing weight. Uh, no hypoglycemia is one, and the lowering of blood pressure. I think there is a typo. Lowering of blood pressure, so blood pressure gets lowered. Side effects are UTIs, particularly in both in men as well as in women, and genital fungal infection, particularly candidal infections are quite common. Candidal vulvovaginitis or candidal balanitis are quite common because of increased release of glucose in the urine that forms a favorable milieu for the fungus to grow in the genitalia. So one has to be very cautious about that. Particularly, the personal hygiene has to be improved. Ca Canagliflozin has got a drug interaction with ritonavir boosted PI. The normal dose of canagliflozin is between 100 to 300 milligram per day. Usually, the starting dose is 100 milligram once daily before the first meal of the day. That is the standard dose. But when you are combining with a boosted PI, this dose may has to be reduced, enhanced to 300 milligram per day. And for all the gliflozins, they would require a renal dose adjustment in case of diminished renal clearance. Now, what are the concerns of treatment of HIV uh, in diabetics? No, but we don't use these days. Avoid stavudine, didanosine and first generation PIs, we are using tenofovir and evacavir, either tenofovir disoproxil fumarate or tenofovir alafenamide we are using these days. And we are also using evacavir sulfate, and few old patients are still on zidovudine. Now, long-term use of zidovudine and lopinavir significantly associated with development of diabetes mellitus, so their use has to be gradually phased out. NNRTIs, on the other hand, they are associated with lower incidence of diabetes mellitus. So that's why, although we are moving from away from nevirapine and efavirenz for other reasons to uh, other classes like INSTI, like dolutegravir or raltegravir or elvitegravir, etc. But we need to remember, we need to, NNRTIs are good as far as diabetes is concerned. That's why the development of molecules like doravirine is very important for us. If that comes into our practice, probably we can offset all these things. Now, we are talking about dolutegravir. We have already discussed earlier also. Dolutegravir is very good drug, very fast acting drug. It brings down the viral load very fast and very potent. You have got a very high genetic barrier. Everything is fine. But long-term use of dolutegravir is associated with weight gain, particularly in female. At least two randomized trials from Africa has shown that. And importantly, when dolutegravir is combined with TAF, then the weight gain is the highest. And while managing such patients and diabetics, when we use antiretrovirals, we need to assess end organ damage like the kidneys, the eyes, the heart, the peripheral vascular disease, the peripheral pulses. All this need to be assessed clinically and by appropriate examination of the diabetics. And the renal function has to be looked into before prescribing an antiretroviral. The creatinine clearance has to be looked into, and to decide on the NRTI backbone on the naive patient, whether it would be evacavir, lamivudine, dolutegravir, or it would be a TAF-FTC, dolutegravir, or TDF-3TC, dolutegravir, depending on the creatinine clearance. I think so. These were the messages that I wanted to drive to this presentation. That there is an increasing overlap between two epidemics. Um, Diabetes in an expanding epidemic in across the globe. Even India is going to be the diabetic capital of the world. People are telling so many stories about it, and HIV is still there. And although the rate of rise of new infection has gone down with increase in access of antiretroviral therapy over the last 5 to 8 years. That's one issue. And HIV positive patients, they are at increased risk of diabetes mellitus at younger age, 20 to 44 years of age group, and in absence of obesity. That's one thing that we need to remember. Otherwise, we have got a notion to think that that guy is an obese, so might have diabetes. He is a lean and thin guy, not unlikely to have diabetes. I think that notion has to be removed, because I have shown you through multiple studies where people are getting diabetes at a younger age. These are all HIV positive people I'm talking about. They are getting diabetes at a younger age, as well as in leaner people are also getting diabetes in addition to the obese ones. And we already have started avoiding first generation PIs and NRTIs, and close follow-up of PLHIV, those who are being put on dolutegravir is needed, because now already there are evidences coming up that people who have received INSTI as a class, whether raltegravir, dolutegravir, or elvitegravir, they are now showing up with diabetes as compared to other classes of drug, particularly NNRTI. I have just told that NNRTI is probably is the most friendly group of drug when it comes to diabetes amongst HIV. And when dealing with such patients, we need to know about little bit about the drug interactions like metformin, dolutegravir, canagliflozin, ritonavir, and saxagliptin, ritonavir, all those little bit of drug interactions that we need to keep it in mind, because our patients might attend ART centers for the antiretrovirals, and he might attend a diabetic clinic or a medicine OP to get medicines from the physicians and all. So we need, there should to be, have to be a very good coordination between these two, that we need to remember. And some of them, they get medicine from the NCD clinics that are coming up across the country. And still there, what we feel that probably there is well-designed multicentric prospective cohort studies needed in the context of India, because in our country, the diabetic features are little different as compared to the others. And in India also, there are divides between south and north and east and west, etc. So we need to look into further. We should, and at the ART centers, we are in a very good position. It's a large cohort of people are attending the ART centers every month, and then every year for for a number of years. So it's possible to develop a good cohort and look into, before they start into their antiretroviral therapy, look into the fasting blood glucose level, and then following them up at least 6 to 12 months interval. We already are testing for blood sugar for all second line patients every 6 months as a mandatorily, people who are on boosted PI, as well as people who are on the dolutegravir as well. So we can probably through NACO, some of the ART centers can consider to develop some sort of multicentric prospective cohort studies for this. I finish here with thanks to everyone for their kind attention. And
yeah, sir,
question?
we have two questions in the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah,
Chat
one
box.
is, I'll tell the question, sir. Does IRIS precipitate as diabetes? And how often we need to keep checking the diabetes status in asymptomatic patients?
No, yes, there are, as I said, there are very few reports of pancreatic islet cell antibodies and anti-GAD antibodies appearing in HIV positive persons after starting antiretroviral therapy with good CD4 recovery and plasma viral suppression. Most of the studies are from Japan, and there are few from other places as well. But the numbers are small, so that's why this could be taken as IRIS, because after these people were normoglycemic, fasting plasma glucose was less than 100 milligram, A1C was less than 6.5% at the baseline. But after all this viral suppression and CD4 recovery took place, then they became diabetic. So in that way, you can be said that there are immune restoration. But the incidence is low. As I said, that there are is very few. So like development of anti-GAD antibody, which was not present initially, or anti-PICA antibody, which was not present initially, then becoming present. The issue is that, so if the patient is normoglycemic once a year, that is the ADA recommendation, blood fasting plasma glucose is good enough. If the patient is not having any high risk, like family history, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, then probably one can go for a 6 monthly. Otherwise, a normal individual and a normal PLHIV on NNRTI based regimen, or having normal blood sugar once a year. But for PI based regimens as well as dolutegravir based regimens, it should be every 6 months. Fasting plasma glucose has to be looked into.
Okay, the next question is, please tell sliding scale insulin and what's the best drug to use in de novo diabetes?
No, I think I am not going into the detail of the sliding scale, because sliding scale is there are issues of there are a school of diabetologists now, they don't prefer to use sliding scale insulin in the inpatient setting, particularly in critically ill patients in the CCU, ICU, etc. And for de novo patient, it all depends. If it is an type 1, definitely it will be insulin. Type 2, patient should start with metformin and then add-on drugs. Now, add-on drugs, we used to use metformin initially, followed by sulfonylurea, because that used to be a cheap combination. Now there are other people are going up for DPP-4 inhibitors or the SGLT2 inhibitors. But these are SGLT2 inhibitors have come recently. These are all costly. Either canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, empagliflozin. These are largely prescribed by diabetologists and endocrinologists, I would say. Physicians generally still use DPP-4 inhibitors or gliptins, vildagliptin, sitagliptin, teneligliptin. These are all options, and linagliptin, particularly in patients with a little bit of rise in serum creatinine, you can still continue with linagliptin and saxagliptin. So I would say that this is one option, but in it differs from center to center in our country. Like in the public health system, majority of the places is first drug would be metformin, add-on sulfonylurea, usually a long-acting like glimepiride. Or but if it is an elderly person, then probably long-acting would be avoided. A shorter acting, or maybe a vildagliptin like a DPP-4 inhibitor like vildagliptin or sitagliptin, or even teneligliptin, which is cheap, will be prescribed because they have got very low incidence of hypoglycemia. And if the initial fasting fasting plasma glucose is more than 250, yes, there would be initially metformin will be combined with the insulin, basal insulin, one of the basal insulins that gives that will preserve. If the patient is having glucotoxicity, having features of dehydration, etc., then probably they would be treated over there. And sliding scale is basically is not in an OP setting or routine IP setting, but it is usually used to be used in critical care units and others.
Yeah, thank you, sir. The next question is how to calculate daily dose of insulin.
Yeah, basically there's a range between 0.2 to 0.5 units per kg body weight, depending or if you're higher blood sugar level and you are relatively younger age group, you can go with 0.3 to 0.4 milligram per kg per day initial dose. If it's an elderly, probably better to start with a lower dose and then gradually titrate it up. 2/3 of the dose, the total insulin, the 2/3 would be given pre-breakfast and 1/3 would be given in the pre-dinner mode. And amongst the pre-breakfast dose also, there would be a portion of pre-mixed insulin, which is the commonly given soluble as well as NPH combined. So that will be also in the 1/3, 2/3 proportion. That's the standard of care. But then again, these days it is being popularized to give a basal insulin at bedtime, at 10 o'clock at bedtime, post dinner, and that will take care of the overnight glucose surge, etc. And then you allow them to use either oral drug, if it is combining with bedtime insulin with daytime sulfonylurea or Bitsu, or if you can use metformin, or you can use other insulins in the daytime also, another intermediate action.
Do we maintain glycemic status data of a patient in the master chart?
In the ART center, we have in the white card, we have places to record blood glucose level every 6 months. That's there. And in the master chart, is it related to the ART?
Yes, yes, sir. Related to the ART center.
ART center. I think I'm not sure. Probably there is a place to write it down, no? Blood sugar. In the white card, it's there. Definitely, the sugar, urea, creatinine, all the hemoglobin, these are all there. CD4, LFT, etc. But in the master card, I can't recollect right now.
Yeah, any more questions? Participants can please unmute themselves or type in the chat box. So no more questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for your informative session and for your time. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you to all the participants.